AmarAtma, welcome to the Front Row Dads podcast, brother. So good to be chatting with you today.
What's going on, John? So good, great to be here, man. Thank you so much.
Can we just talk for a moment about who connected us?
So yeah, we got a mutual homie, man, that's connected us, and what a special man. He's a member of your group, and he reached out to me and let me know that some of the stuff that I do was inspiring around grief work, and he's like, Front Row Dads would love to have this kind of conversation into your group. And full disclosure, I'm not a dad, so by no means am I going to speak to something that's outside of my lane, outside of my scope. But just the work that him and I have been able to do and connect together just created an opportunity for us to share in this way. And we've had to reschedule a couple of times. I'm really excited for us to be here right now.
Yeah. How do you tell people what you do, man? When you read your bio, it's for me, it opened up all sorts of questions like, what is that? And how do I even pronounce that? And so I said, today, I'm just going to let you tell us what you do, how you show up for the world. What are you passionate about? What have you studied? Give us whatever you want as far as context.
Dude, I'm like one of those guys that grew up as like a young kid, but sensitive to people's emotions. Like I don't know where it came from. And I grew up with a ton of alpha male, toxic masculinity energy in my family. I'm a first generation Indian American. My family's all from India. I was born in Canada. So we grew up in the States, and I grew up in Southern California, Northern California. And just my experience of moving through the world was emotionally attuned. I can feel almost like an X-ray vision to people's wounds and pain, like an empathic capacity. And I could see where people were bullshitting. I could see where people were, fighting with themselves. I could see where they're masking areas of their life, and I call them out on it. And then it became a taboo. All of a sudden, I became stigmatized for this sort of skill, and it wasn't harnessed at all. And Indian culture, you got to appreciate, man, like we come from British colonialism. There's a partition. Our world is like deranged, and we are working to survive. If you're not a doctor, lawyer, engineer, what are you doing with your life? You got to build security and survival. So that's the mentality of my family system. And here am I talking about things in a much more emotional, perhaps even a spiritual, existential oriented way. And that's very confusing for me. It's very confusing to them. So needless to say, I was a very difficult child to raise.
Wait a minute. What does your family think about you now?
Oh, they totally appreciate and respect it, for sure.
I mean, we go right in there real quick. Coming. I mean, I didn't know what answer you were going to give me, but that's great.
Yeah. Well, they see the evolution, man. They see the kind of inner work that's been a part of my life. And it came through a lot of dark nights of the soul, to be honest. Like it was 20 years of kind of hell, It was existential, man. It was suicidal ideations, a couple of attempts. It was raw, man. And I felt like a fish out of water. I felt very displaced within my own spirit, within my own self, and definitely within my community. And I got a hold of drugs at a young age. Actually, I turned 21 and stopped drinking, stopped smoking, stopped doing things. And so you can just understand that a lot of my teen years was filled with a lot of stuff that was pretty raw and exposed to areas of life that, was just behaviors that were very self-destructive. Through that process of my own evolution, I found transpersonal psychology, which is the field of psychology that's a leg of humanistic psychology, which is Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow's thinking around peak performances and peak experiences and patient-centered care. And, I just really got called to that. That was something that was very powerful for me. Then I go into Chinese medicine, and I studied acupuncture and Qigong and, just a different way of looking at medicine. I got a ton of doctors in my family, and I just saw the sort of professionalism that came across with doing it for work and not necessarily for patient-oriented care. And so I found a different path to that. I became a minister, so I did a dual master's degree, one in Chinese medicine and then another in ministry, into my faith as a Sikh. Yeah, man, it evolves, man. I became a chaplain. I worked end-of-life care for several years. I did the residency program and CPE, and I worked at a level 1 trauma center, and I worked in the trauma bays. I worked in the ICUs. I worked in oncology. I worked adult. I worked pediatrics. I worked inpatient psych. So I started to really appreciate the nature of the emotions, grief, death, and my own development of self through all of that and my own personal formation. Needless to say, grief found me. And it took me 20 years to understand that the pain of my childhood was grief. Took me 10 years to understand what grief was, and 8 years, 9 years continuation of putting that into practice to make a difference in other people's lives around tangible and intangible forms of loss in their life.
What is grief by your definition?
Grief is a natural response to any change or loss that happens in life. Now, most times people think of grief as like, oh, I had a death. Okay, now I'm grieving that, right? And most of the times we're very scared of grief. It's the thing that we want to have like arm's length away from us, because it's like, oh crap, man, once grief hits in your life, forget about it, man. You're going to drown your whole life. Your whole life is changed. And I saw that, man. I felt that for myself and I felt that for others. But the thing about it is that I think of grief as like a much broader scope than death. It's the change or loss of experiences that happen. It's these subtle, small things that are taking place. A move in childhood, loss of a friendship, a fight with a friend that you've lost connection with. It's a relationship of financial difficulties, like a mortgage of a house, or even having kids and losing autonomy and independence. It's divorces, it's breakups, it's rejections, it's a change of a job, it's a second career, it's a recession, it's inflation. All these massive changes that are happening around life create losses. And those losses, there's a part of our being that's seeking to identify the unfulfilled needs emotionally of that experience, and how is it to reclaim what was lost. And that part of us is the grief experience that we're feeling all the time. It's like a loan with a high interest rate. And we think that time heals this wound, but it's an experience for us that is like a loan with a high interest rate. If you don't put work into it, it just accumulates and builds over time. So what used to be like a pebble of a loss turns into a rock, turns into a boulder, becomes heavy, and we carry that weight and that pain in our life. Takes up our bandwidth, our energy, our vitality. It eclipses a light from within. It takes away ability to operate with efficiency, problem solve, think clearly, aspects of our relationships. This is grief. This is what's happening for us. And I can continue to talk, and the way that I experience it is that people are very unaware of the unresolved grief experiences that are happening within their life, from childhood or from teenage years or from adulthood, that continue to build. And so when we try to do behavior change, optimal health, feel awesome, feel stoked, have the best kind of relationship with our partners, be the best kind of parent we want to be, have the best job, make the best kind of finance that we can do. Sometimes it's like, what's the block? Why isn't it getting there? Well, I want to practice mindfulness. I want to practice meditation. I can't get a rhythm of doing it. I want to start to journal on a regular basis. Why is it that's preventing me from doing it? A lot of this time, we got our CPU being taken up by unresolved layers of grief that are taking place in our life, that when we start to work on it, okay, now we start getting energy and vitality coming into our life.
So guys,
it hit me. That's what it is.
Guy's driving down the road right now and he's listening to this, and I'm just trying to imagine what he might be thinking or she might be thinking. But it's it's kind of like, well, do I really have a lot of grief? If I do, what grief? And how would I begin to feel that grief? And then maybe like when we start to feel it, maybe the question that pops up immediately is, am I just complaining? Am I just being a big baby here? Like we start to shame ourselves for even feeling that, right? Like you grow up in like a middle-class neighborhood, and the minute you start to think anything was wrong with your childhood, you're like, dude, shut up, John. Like there's so many other people in the world that had it way worse than you. Stop being a big baby. And you discount maybe perhaps whatever grief you had because you compare it to somebody else's grief and it's not as seemingly significant as theirs. So talk to us a little bit about like, what is a dude thinking right now as it relates to how do I identify it? And how do I process, like, is this something I even need to work on or not?
I would say to the guy right now that whatever grief that comes into your mind from hearing this part of the conversation, like a loss of a homie or a move when you were growing up, or your parents having to work full time and you not having really quality connections with them, or whatever experience that, you might have a parent who's passing away and you're kind of thinking back in their life and like, oh crap, I feel like I haven't had a relationship with them at all my whole life. I'm not just grieving their death, I'm grieving the relationship we never had. That's real and it's valid. and are minimizing, are invalidating, our judging, our shaming, our comparing, our competing is getting in the way from optimal health. Now we got to appreciate that grief leads to what? Grief is a tool. Grief is a portal to what? Aliveness, feeling stoked, having energy, creativity, more presence in our life. And that's what's missing. That's what's missing from our world. That's exactly why I do what I do, because world peace through inner peace, and we're missing that inner peace. We're on fire inside. We're cooking inside. So we're suppressing a lot of our emotions and suppressing our experiences, because it's like, oh man, I didn't grow up in Syria, in a war-torn area. I wasn't a part of a genocide. I wasn't part of a natural disaster, 9/11, so how is it that how do I have grief? Nah, it's there. It's there. It's real. And it's an emotional experience. And there's a part of an inner child that's calling out to say, hey, I want my voice to be heard. It's like we're driving in a car, but we got our inner child steering the wheel and is driving our life. So this unfulfilled needs of our child is driving us into our lives, trying to get that aspect of our life fulfilled. And it's happening through our relationships. It's happening through our work experiences. I'd say, no, let's get our adult self in charge, put that guy back in the driver's seat. And let's say, okay, let's take care of you, inner child. What's going on here? What's happening? Let's give voice to this experience. Let's give some permission.
Talk to me about grief in marriages, right? Or long-term partnerships. And let me seed this with some context. So I see in others, I hear the stories. I also have experienced it myself personally, that there are moments in my now 16 years with Tatiana, my relationship, that there are chapters, there are seasons, there are moments when I have a lot of grief about a lot of things in the past of our relationship, right? There's sadness to like things that happened in our relationship, things we might have said to each other in front of the kids, things we said to each other that were mean and hurtful over text message or in person, right? There's so much, trauma, we could use that word, although, maybe little t trauma and maybe some big T, depending on who's interpreting the data. But, talk to me a little bit about in that scenario. Let's just start there with a person in a relationship looking back and going, I think I have a lot of grief about my relationship. Not that they're ready to get divorced per se. Maybe they are. And I'm not trying to determine whether or not they should stay together or get separated. I'm talking about processing grief in a relationship, things they may have regretted, things they didn't do in their relationship that they regret, right? And I want to talk about kids too, even though you said earlier you're not a dad. We all have fatherly instincts, whether it's to our own children or other children in the world. So anyway, talk to me about relationships, man. What should I be thinking about there?
I think you kind of brought up the key word there, man, the regret, right? So like the grief of regret, very powerful. The grief of failed opportunities, very powerful. There are ways that we want to come across, the ways that we feel ourselves as a man and our value and our aspects of who we are and our integrity. Sometimes we're not in our integrity. We're uncharacteristic. We make a mistake. We do something that, harms a relationship to our partners. And how do we make amends for that? How do we come into a relationship that? That's very powerful. That's a very big grief experience. It's very powerful because when I look back on my relationship with my wife, I have some regrets as well. Some things that I wish I had done better, some things I wish I had done differently, some things I wish I had done more. And my wife and I were nearly married 10 years. And I look back on our relationship, I'm like, crap, I should have fucking done that better. I could have done more of that in our time. I wish I was a better person, or I could have done things a little differently in that way. And I carry shame around it. I carry embarrassment around it. Embarrassment's becoming a big for me these days, where I can kind of lean into that experience. It's like, oh yeah, there's all sorts of emotions. I'm angry with myself. I'm frustrated with myself. I keep making the same mistake. How do I shift my behavior in that? She keeps telling me to do something differently. Crap, I keep trying. I keep messing up. I'm beating myself up all the time. I'm afraid I can't be the man that I'm seeking to be, that I think I am within myself, I can't come across in that way. Grief experiences. Right? Grief experiences.
How do we begin?
So,
How do we begin to, what word would you use here? Is it transform, transmute, evolve through, accept? Like, I don't know what words to be using, but the point is, how do we shift?
so I think that for me, the work that I do is face, embrace, release. We're going to own up to it. We got to be real with ourselves about it, and then embrace the part of ourselves that is in that scenario. What is going on? What is it that I'm feeling? What is it that's happening inside me? Let me come into it, and not just from a thought wave, not just from a story or a narrative that's coming inside my head, not just an interpretation or an analysis or an argument within myself about being right or not being right, because that's what sometimes happens in relationships. Oh no, I'm justified in that behavior. I'm still carrying the wound of an uncharacteristic experience, and part of owning up into that. So in some ways, we want to get into a little bit more of an embracing, a little bit of the emotional space, the heart space around that. That's very powerful. So then, yeah, we can say, I like to use the word evolving. I like the word maturing. I like the words growing. Transforming works as well when it comes to grief, because inherently grief at this level with these intangible losses, not necessarily a loss of a person through death, a partnership or a child, through miscarriage or other pieces of death that come in. That's a very different kind of aspect of grief. These are some of the intangible aspects of grief, some of the things that we don't normally talk about with a broader scope of thinking about grief. In that way, inherently, grief is like the compost that makes the right soil, that creates the right vegetation, the right flowers that grow up. It's the shit of life that helps us to grow and to evolve and to mature. And we want to have that transforming energy to utilize that as an opportunity for us to face, embrace, and release into it.
I realize that what I'm trying to ask next is probably an impossible question, right? But it comes up for me of like, how much is too much grief? Like, sometimes I think to myself in my relationship, I go, should it be this hard? Like, is this a sign to me that I'm in the wrong relationship? When you think about grief, sadness of something, when I think about grief, the term sadness comes up. Are we defining it similarly?
No, grief is not an emotion, it's a response. So we don't want to get caught with grief being a single emotion. Grief comes with all the emotions, all tangled up at the same time, which is why it's so confusing for us. It's not sadness or emptiness or woefulness. It's anger, frustration, fear, overwhelm, gratitude, relief, sadness, loneliness, all jumbled up in together. That's what makes grief so powerful and difficult to sort of process it. That's why I do what I do, is because we got to start to tease out what it is that we're feeling and what are the different losses that we're experiencing here. It's like a wave on a long shore that's building and building and building. It's not just the break of the wave, it's the wave that's been building for a long time. So in some ways, we have to really allow ourselves to sort of recognize what's too much grief. We all got unresolved grief. We all got an invisible backpack we're carrying of unresolved grief. We all do. It's different for us in terms of its weight and its heaviness. Some people might have major losses of their life, many boulders, and some people might have a ton of sand in there, a lot of little ones, a lot of lowercase t traumas that have been a part of their life, and that they carry a bag of sand, and that's heavy, right? So, the experience of too much grief or too much sadness, we have a bit of a toxic positivity culture, where we tend to suppress emotions, where we try to push things away, try to have a positive mindset. But from my chaplaincy work, from my end of life care work, I have found that actually the human spirit is so much stronger than we ever really give it credit for. And especially when it comes to our emotional space, we're not as fragile as we think we are. And when we get into the emotional space, we can lean in a little bit more into it, and we can actually come out feeling really pretty awesome. It's like the dark will lead us closer to the light. And if we could stop judging emotions being negative emotions or positive emotions or dark emotions versus light emotions, and recognize that one of the ways why grief is so overwhelming for us is because it's something that's taking us into a forest where we don't have a map. It's uncharted territory for us. It's unfamiliar terrain. What's the difference between anger and frustration? Frustration and irritability and annoyance. What's the difference between fear that comes from weakness versus inferiority or a lack of confidence or being straight terrified and scared out of my mind. How do we be able to decipher between specificity of emotions so that we can learn this deeper vernacular of a recognition of, oh, this emotional terrain is all of a sudden grief is teaching me about a part of myself that I really don't have any recognition in. Never learned about grief. We're never taught about grief. We're never taught around what to do with loss. We're taught how to acquire things, not what to do when we lose them. How do we really spend some time in that? And that takes us to an emotional journey within us. And by giving us a little bit of space and utilize grief as a portal to this realm within our being, this sort of phantom arm that we keep cutting off, but it's still present in our life, and be like, okay, what do you have to teach me? How can I grow through this? All of a sudden, man, like that's the maturation. That's like soul work. That's deep spiritual work that we can start coming in for us. It becomes a portal to something pretty extraordinary.
How do we teach men to support each other through this process? You know, because one way to approach this is, hey, this is what you do. You're a coach. I hire you. We work through this. That's cool. We got an option there, but you can't serve the thousands of people that listen to this podcast.
Wait, what? What?
Say, wait a minute. Hold on. I take that
back. Whoa.
You can serve all the thousands of people.
Yes.
Sorry. I'm thinking I'm thinking more of the one-to-one. You can't talk one-to-one with the thousands of people that are listening to this podcast. How do we help these men talk to each other? How do we help them to listen, to show up, to support the brothers in their lives who, if they start to recognize signs of grief, or maybe the questions that lead us into acknowledging it and then helping somebody to move through it or accept it, etc.
Man, I think that this is the key question for us, man. Like, how do we build community of like-minded men who don't shame or judge us for our emotional experience? How do we create experiences where we can maintain vulnerability in a heart-centered space and have bro culture that's so much more supportive rather than wanting up each other or competing with each other in that kind of context? How do we have a little bit more of a support, man, where we feel with each other through empathy and not necessarily talk over each other? Like that becomes a question here, because if we're all carrying grief, we're all carrying regret, we're all carrying things that were uncharacteristically done to our wives, to our partners, and our ways of being a parent to a child. Like, crap, I wish I had done that better, and not necessarily problem solving it, not necessarily trying to fix it and come into a relationship like, I hear you, bro. I hear you. I feel you. And come into a relationship like, oh man, tell me a little bit more about that. What is it that you wish you could have done better in that situation? Like, oh man, like I wish, like with my kid, like I just did scream at them, and it really wasn't about them. I mean, they were being kind of annoying in that moment, but for me, it was just like, I had this work thing coming up and I didn't realize I was like pissed about this situation, and I took it out on my kid and like, crap, and it's like, man, and then asking the question, open-ended questions to each other. I'm like, how would you want to have come across, in the next situation? It's probably going to come again. What would you want to do? Create an opportunity for us to have this growth within each other. The thing about it is, like, grief work doesn't have to be like where you have a professional coach to kind of do it. It's a human experience. That's what gets me, man. It's a universal experience. There's not one human being in this world that's not going to experience grief, but we don't have universal support for it. It's a human thing, man. We're going to all have grief experiences. And so for us as men is evolving into a space of being like, I hear you. I feel you. Absolutely. This is some of the experiences I've had when I come across a situation, not to problem solve, but to empathize with. That to me is very special. And to be honest, for me, it's few and far between where I have homies in my life that kind of lean into that level of an experience. As soon as somebody starts problem solving for me or fixing the experience for me, I'm like, oh man, I'm shut down, man. I'm just like, all right.
I'm curious about that real quick. Let's hang there for a second about who in your life, when it comes to the person who truly sees you, right? Empathizes with you, holds space for your grief, helps you process your grief because perhaps they share their own reflections. What name comes to mind? Who is that dude for you?
I'll be honest, it's few and far between. I'll be straight with you. I do it mostly on my own. I really lean into it on my own. Loneliness has been a big part of my life for many years. I'm gonna caveat this by saying one homie of mine, Mangala Sadhu Sangeet. He's a fellow Sikh brother of mine. He's in Phoenix, and He's a bro that I know that if I need anything, I need some support, like he's right there. We can hold that emotional, empathetic space with each other. Beautiful. I feel like I can do it really well for him. He does it brilliantly for me.
Mm-hmm.
But to be totally honest, man, I've lived with sort of the emotional experience so much in my life that I've developed, probably to a fault, an experience of holding space for myself.
Mm.
And I might go further and say that mostly it's not men who help support them, because there's a sort of, like, I've specialized in grief work. So there's a bit of like an emotional scuba diver that I am, like I can go deep. I'm not just a snorkeler, man. I just don't surf the oceans, man. I go deep. I hit the abyss. I find the world underneath the world. And women tend to be the people that I tend to go to the most. A lot of my coaches are women. My wife is very special. The people that we have in our life are women who tend to hold that level of space. And so there's a much more of a safety to connect with them, because their capacity to hold into that emotional regard is something that comes a little bit more natural to them than with men. It's just like, okay, man, like I feel like I'm often teaching men how to hold space, and that work becomes like, oh man, this is not doing it for me. So I hold that space for myself.
The gentleman you just mentioned a second ago, I didn't catch the name, but what does he do specifically? Like, maybe you can use him as a case study to, what's his energy like? How does he show up? Why do you feel so connected to him? Are there specific words or phrases that he uses, a cadence perhaps, or a tone? Like if we were to just look at him as a case study.
The way that he does it well is that he maintains eye contact. He's not on his phone. He's not looking around at other things that are happening in his life. When we're hanging out together, his attention is like right there with me with him. He's got that capacity to sort of be present and to make you feel like we're present with each other. He doesn't interrupt when we're talking. He allows me to kind of go on my 15-minute diatribe or soapbox or experience of a story, even if it doesn't make sense and it's disjointed in terms of its story. He allows me to kind of evolve within my conversation of thought and experience. He doesn't argue with me about how I feel. He's not trying to invalidate my experience or try to compete with what it is that's going on. He's not trying to make me justify what it is that I feel or play devil's advocate to another point of view. He's allowing me to have my space. And when I get finished talking, he reflects back to me about how it is that what he heard. With open-ended questions, he's like, oh man, I hear that, man. That's really, really tough. How have you been doing through that experience? What have you learned through that? What is something that you feel like is evolving through you in this experience? These are the kind of questions that are supportive, that when I'm finished my 15-minute whatever monologue on it, it doesn't stop there and then we move on to another subject. It's not a situation where he starts talking about himself or his story about it, where I feel like I'm cut off and when I just have this huge moment of vulnerability. He allows me to evolve within it. I allow him to evolve through his conversation. That level of specificity and attention is quality, man. It's not like there's a timetable in it.
Do you think there's a moment also, I know it's not the topic of our conversation as it relates to grief perhaps, but as it relates to how we empathize with somebody, how we listen, how we show up, how we hold space. Do you see value in there being a moment when you bring a really strong statement like, dude, you're fooling yourself? Or do you think there's a moment when you kind of call your brother out and you're not just listening anymore? Because if you listen and you're like, man, I really feel you, and you just hear a story where he's selling himself short and he's playing the victim and he's, and everybody's out to get him. And there's a moment when you're like, I can't listen to this anymore, dude. You're totally playing the victim. I
think that's like a card you put like an Uno deck. You got a few of those cards that like change the colors. It's like, it's not every card that's like that. You got like 4 or 5 of those in a deck, man. So like those are choice experiences. Yeah. I got a buddy of mine that I was connecting with. We went for a walk and it was sweet, man. We're right by a creek. It's been raining a bunch in California. And he was telling me about this girl and this relationship and this breakup. And the woman ended up getting married like 2 or 3 months after they broke up, but he didn't know about it. He's like, what the fuck, man? Like, we were about to be married. We were almost engaged. And yet she's 2 or 3 months later hooked up with this other guy. And it was for money and this whole thing. But as he evolved that conversation, telling me his experience, and I'm holding space and just letting him sort of just do his thing, just as I mentioned with you, there sort of became a point where he started to kind of beat himself up for it, shame himself. Now I know him well enough to be like, that might be a pattern where he might go into, where it becomes his fault why she did this, or why this ended up evolving. He's had previous relationships. So it became a story he was telling himself. And I was like, bro, shut the fuck up, man. Like, nah. And he's like, what? And I'm like, and then I called him out just like that experience. It's like, this is bullshit. Like, I'm not going to let you beat yourself up over this thing. This was wrong what she's doing. You know, she left you and hooked up with this other guy. Like, this is all on her side, man. You're a beautiful man. And then I praised him up. I lifted him up. And I was like wondering, it's like, oh man, am I like derailing him? Am I taking away his vulnerability? It was like a moment of confrontation to where he was at. And I was nervous a little bit inside me if that was going to be difficult for him. He just looked at me and he had like tears in his eyes. And he was like, bro, thank you so much. And I was like, oh, I feel you, man. And he's like, I totally get into that mindset where I just mess with myself and I make myself to blame for that. I'm like, I hear you. And we allowed that to then be the evolution of the conversation where that happens in his life. And that was cool because it went from about this girl to about him in a much more deeper kind of conversation. Then we allowed that to evolve. And that was really beautiful. So it was like straight up Uno card deck, red color changed to yellow color. And it was, I think he felt heard, he felt supported. And I think he felt enlivened from the nature of that support that was extended.
Let's talk for a moment about habits, routines, and rhythms that a guy can take from this conversation and say, look, what would you prescribe to him? Hey, every Monday, do this. Once a week, do this. Every month, check in here with these questions. Or how does somebody build the habit of noticing, right, grief, and then choosing to work through it? Talk to me about routines and processes and how they might look at that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. A lot of times what happens, I'm gonna go like 3-pronged on this one. Okay, just so you know, but there's 3 things that come to my mind. We need a daily relationship to release. Like a daily relationship to release. And what I mean by that is an emotional release. So whether you're journaling or you're voice memoing or you're dictating, we need something where we can have an elongated process of just bullshit coming out of our head, like a mental dump. I do morning pages, morning from Julia Cameron's work from The Artist's Way, and 3 pages, uninterrupted, unbroken cycle of writing. Take 10 to 15 minutes and just dump your brain. It's an important practice, whether you do that daily or regularly. This is one of the first exercises I teach to all the people that I work with. We need to get out of our thoughts and out of our head. That's one thing. The next thing I'm going to mention is let's become aware of our distractions. We call these STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. When we feel something uncomfortable, maybe even painful, a trigger, what's our go-to pleasure that makes us feel good, that dopamine hit? Cheez-Its, TV watching, porn, gambling, alcohol. What do we go to? That's that. Let's start to name those things in our life that is that pleasure hit for us, that dopamine hit. Okay? Let's start to become aware and bring awareness to when something kind of triggers us. Where do we go to kind of take ourselves out of that experience? And the third piece to that is let's start to develop a relationship of spending 30 seconds before we go and do that thing, 30 seconds to 1 minute, and feeling what it is that we're feeling there. Right? Pay attention to what's going on without reaction and create space and pause. Have a response rather than a reaction. And then ask ourselves, is this going to actually make me feel better doing that behavior? Or is this just going to mask or buffer what I'm feeling?
May seem like a total tangent, but it's not. It's related to this, the aware of your distractions. You called them STIRBs, right? Short-term energy releasing behaviors. Yeah. Assuming alcohol would fit into that, right? Grabbing a beer.
Yeah, so there's short-term and long-term, right? Yeah, short-term and long-term, right?
What's your relationship to alcohol, let's say, in your life? 0?
I don't drink alcohol. 0.
Is that part of it, being Sikh? Is that part of culturally?
Yeah, it's part of being Sikh, but I started drinking before I became a Sikh. Like I said, I turned 21 and stopped drinking.
That was it. You were done forever. What then do you, have you noticed into your adult life were your stirbs?
Yeah. So stirbs for me are like social media, doom scrolling. Stirbs for me are pizza, huge time, like getting that salt, oil, carbs hit. That's huge for me. Binge watching TV, like getting that extra episode in, third episode in, fourth episode in, taking that time. Other pieces of stirbs for me are a little bit more nuanced. I have an addiction to shame, shaming myself. That's a big one for me. Something bad happens, I beat myself up. Something doesn't go necessarily my way, I start to do a lot of worse critic reality for myself. Something doesn't necessarily unfold in the way that I had hoped to unfold. What's wrong with me? What did I do again? Oh shit, here he goes again, messing up again. And I go into the shame spiral story. That's a stirb for me. It's like an experience where I almost get like a dopamine hit from it, even though it feels like, why would somebody feel pleasure from that? There's so much familiarity in being my own worst enemy and my own worst critic that I'm kind of like vibe into a space and being like, oh yeah, here I go. So I'm in a real like courageous leap right now into, as soon as shame thoughts come in, it's like a stirb experience where it's like, okay, I'm starting to shame, I'm not going to go there. Like I got to be real conscious, real intentional, real mindful, not going there, not jumping into that boat, not jumping into that hoop. And then I go into self-praise. I go into areas of my life where it's like, oh bro, you are, do a lot of like self-lift up, self-positive self-talk. And that's very, very powerful for me right now.
Wow. I love this, man. I actually think that's a perfect place for us to wrap today, because it feels very actionable, very concrete, and a great summary of what we talked about throughout the call today. But I do want to not have the final word and say that for you, number one, if people are interested in working with you, learning more about your coaching programs, please tell us about that. And number two, just as a general, if you have any final thoughts on what I think we both felt our way into today, was this grief of regret. If there's anything that we needed to say about that we didn't say. So those two things, where to find coaching, and any other kind of final thoughts to help us land the plane on the grief of regret.
Yeah, I would say like the grief of regret is strong, man. I think that regret is a powerful teacher for our life. I heard somebody say once that it's the negative film to the photograph we're trying to develop. If we can appreciate regret as a teacher for us, it can really help us live into how we want to live with integrity, into more of our value and the ways that we characterize ourselves. I think that sitting with people who are dying, which was a big part of my work for many, many years, the two core emotions that they came up with, that each person, even though they may have had a lot of gratitude, a lot of love in their life, there were still two core emotions that were very present: regret and disappointment. And I think that if we can recognize that regret is a natural part of life, but if we can utilize it as a teacher for us, it can be very powerful. So then if we think of grief of regret, that's like the first step to our journey there. Shit, I didn't do that well. Shit, I wasn't really my best self in that context. And we can lean into that. I could feel you taking a deep breath into that experience. That's like a feel
Just
of like,
thinking about this morning.
Do tell, man. Let's hear it.
We don't have time.
Oh, you brought it up, man.
We don't have time for that story today. Oh, geez.
All right, that's cool. Yeah, no, but for real, like like where I might mansplain, to my wife, where I might live into patriarchy, where I might be in sort of some forms of misogyny, where I talk a good talk, but I don't walk it, where I take my frustration and anger out on my kids or my family, where I am working too much and don't create quality time, where working becomes a stirb for me. So stirbs become the avenue to regret. Stirbs are taking us away from our authenticity because it's masking something that's more pure inside ourselves. So to tie stirbs and buffering and masking pain, those eventually then become the regrets because it's taking us away from vulnerability, intimacy, and connection, which is what we're all seeking. That's the teacher. That's the teacher for us. And I might say that we might have more unresolved grief than we might ever Like, it's like, oh crap, if I unzip that backpack, man, I'm just going to drown forever. And I'm going to say, gee, that's not the way it works. People become afraid of grief because it feels like we're going to drown in emotions. We don't drown in our emotions. We drown in our thoughts about our emotions. It's the interpretation and the analysis that keeps happening. And the issue is that unresolved emotional pain can even make the most educated highly unintelligent. And what we want to do is kind of lean into it. And the cool thing about grief, we haven't really talked about it, is that when we have these stirbs and we don't lean into the regrets and try to work on those parts of ourselves, we're inherently fighting with ourselves. We're at war with ourselves. We're in an inner conflict. And there's a part of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, that fight flight response. It's a mobilization that is perpetuated through that. So there's a lot of studies, and I've recently just wrote an article about this, that suppressing emotions leads to increased pain and inflammation in our body. Unresolved emotional pain has a physiological response. And the brilliance of that is saying, hey, this is important. Hey, we got to pay attention to this. But secondly, that when we start leaning into this work, we have a nervous system that's seeking homeostasis. We have a nervous system that's seeking harmony and balance. And when we can stop fighting ourselves, that homeostasis of neuroendocrine function starts to work for us rather than against us. That makes it so that why I do coaching work with people is because it's like, oh crap, I'm going to be working with people for like years and years helping to unresolve this. And I'm like, no, it actually happens very quickly. Because as soon as we stop fighting and we start leaning in, it's amazing how the physiology starts to support our process, and we start feeling better quicker and easier because we're not using an unconscious amount of willpower to suppress that experience. And that is something that's so important for people to know about. You're not going to drown by doing grief work. You're not. You allow it and it come in. Just got to watch how the mind is going to interpret those feelings. That's where we really drown. But emotions are like flowers, man. They just want to blossom and bloom, and then they wilt away and die, becoming organic material. This is how it works. So that's the sort of like piece I want to speak about that I think rounds out our larger part of our conversation to this. Where people can find me is I'm active on social media, Instagram, Facebook. AmarAtma Coaching is my handle for that. So it's AmarAtma. That's my name, coaching. AmarAtmaCoaching.com is my website. You can go to the services page. You can learn about the services I provide. I offer a 12-session coaching program as the initial stage of the work I do with people. I lead them through first phase of emotional resiliency, teach about what grief is and what grief isn't, and then utilize specific techniques that I've learned in grief work over many, many years to be able to create a scenario that helps us to create that transformative experiences, and 12 weeks can do the work. Like, it's surprising. I didn't think it could happen. I fought me doing this work for a long time, but it's like legit. And I utilize a lot of somatic work within it. So I'm trained in Qigong and meditation and mindfulness and yoga and breathing exercises. So we utilize a lot of nervous system regulation kind of style work to quiet the mind so that we can enter into the emotions in a real sweet and gentle way, so that this work doesn't leave us with like emotional hangovers and like emotional vulnerability experiences, or I got to go into a cave and be in retreat for 3 months. It's not like that at all. We can have integrated experiences, and I teach exercises for all that. So that's the nature of my work and the container in which I have created right now to help support.
Well, this has been fun. Fun. Is that the word I wanted to use? No, this has been really meaningful. That's the word I wanted to use. Soulful. I'm really grateful that we were able to explore this. I'm really grateful of where we landed on the daily release, aware of distractions, and the minute of being uncomfortable with things. It feels very tangible to me. It feels very actionable to me. I really appreciate that. And I also want to appreciate you for the way that you just kind of summed up our conversation. That was also a great way to wrap things. AmarAtma, thank you, my friend. I look forward to more. I hope men connect with you. I hope to continue to watch you bring your work to the world. I feel it's important. I was talking to somebody today and I said, here's the topic of the podcast I'm about to dig into. And they're like, that sounds fascinating. And it's important work. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. I appreciate you being here today.
I appreciate it, John. Thank you so much.